In Part 1, we've broken down the covert investigative gear and the heavy psychological toll hidden inside Chris Redfield's Paris apartment, as shown in the Resident Evil Veronica announcement trailer. Here in Part 2, we're unpacking the possible reason why the concierge lady calls him odd, examining Chris's physical aspect, how and when he slipped out of his apartment, and the smaller environmental clues you might have missed. Let's dive in. In Part 1, we talked about the concierge lady's nod to Chris's Boulder meme. But that wasn't the only detail she dropped. She also remarked that her American tenant was quite odd.
I hate to say it, but your brother is, well, quite odd.
What does she mean by that? Now, to be completely fair, after surviving the mansion incident, it is entirely possible that Chris was just genuinely acting odd. The psychological aftermath would be enough to make anyone reclusive and erratic. But before we chalk it all up to trauma, we need to look at his history. Because there is a very strong possibility that this odd behavior isn't just a natural symptom. It's a calculated strategy. Chris has a documented pattern of using behavioral misdirection. Look no further than Jill's diary in the original Resident Evil 3. In her entry, Jill notes that after returning from the Spencer mansion, Chris started acting completely out of character, causing a lot of trouble at the precinct. He was constantly irritated, isolated himself from the team, and even punched a fellow officer over spilled coffee. To the RPD, he looked completely unstable. But as he walked away from the scuffle, he gave Jill a silent wink. It was all a brilliant act. Chris deliberately created a scene to force Chief Irons to grant him a vacation, giving him the perfect legal cover he needed to slip away to Europe and hunt Umbrella without raising alarms. Knowing he's used this strategy before, we have to ask, what is the tactical goal behind his odd behavior in Paris? While the trailer doesn't give us concrete details, we can make some educated deductions. First, strategic deterrence. If you act cold, strange, or unapproachable, neighbors and landlords are much more likely to keep their distance and leave you alone. When you're hiding sensitive spy gear and classified Umbrella files in a small apartment, keeping snooping eyes away from your door is rule number 1. Second, he is deliberately stripping away his elite cop identity. Chris Redfield made a name for himself as a decorated STARS agent. Umbrella probably has spotters hunting down a skilled military-trained marksman that matches his profile. Acting strange and completely out of character makes him much harder to identify. By breaking his usual behavioral pattern and downplaying how lethal he actually is, Chris attempts to mask his presence in the city. This brings us to a truth that gets overlooked way too often. Chris is far smarter than people give him credit for. As the self-proclaimed Chris Redfield #1 fan and supporter, I'll never get tired of saying this. Chris has the brain to go with the brawn. The community loves to paint him as just the muscle. But details like this serves as a proof that he is a sharp, intelligent, and calculating tactician who knows exactly how to navigate through his missions. And when you look at his future, rising to become a captain in the BSAA and eventually leading the elite Hound Wolf squad, it all makes sense. You don't get to command top-tier anti-bioterror units with muscles alone. It takes a leader who possesses both exceptional physical capability and a brilliant tactical mind. Chris Redfield has always had both. Speaking of his muscles, let's talk about his physical state in this specific timeline. Beyond the psychological clues, the apartment reveals some really interesting details about Chris's physical state. For years, the common consensus in the Resident Evil community was that Chris didn't start dramatically bulking up until after getting beaten up by Wesker, later in the Code Veronica story. The idea was that getting utterly overpowered by Wesker in Code Veronica triggers a massive training regimen before the events of Resident Evil 5. But the announcement trailer for the remake might have reframed that timeline. If you look closely at the floor near the couch, you can see heavy professional-grade dumbbells sitting right alongside his scattered investigation files. This means Chris didn't wait for a wake-up call from Wesker, specifically. Even this early in the timeline, he already recognizes that he needs to step up and is actively prepping his body for higher levels of physical conflicts against his enemies. But I believe there's a tragic, psychological reason for these waits too. As a man dealing with severe PTSD from the mansion incident, Chris uses intense, grueling exercise as a way to channel his pent-up stress, anxiety, and trauma. When your mind won't let you sleep, driving your body to absolute physical exhaustion becomes a coping mechanism. Lugging heavy workout gear into a temporary short-term apartment shows just how much he prioritizes this training. He's essentially using physical discipline to keep his inner chaotic mental state at bay while preparing for another inevitable physical altercation against Umbrella and their bioweapons ahead. Now, let's look at the remaining items in the apartment that tell us when he might have left and how. The environment is filled with clues that show Chris departed in a hurry, running just a few days or even hours before Claire arrived. The first major hint of a sudden departure is an open foam food container sitting on the dining table. Chris didn't even take the time to finish his meal, let alone throw the trash away. He simply dropped what he was doing and left. This urgency is further emphasized by his silver lighter left behind on the coffee table. In the original game, this lighter is a key item passed between Chris, Claire, and Rodrigo. Leaving something so personal behind proves his departure was not planned. In the trailer, Claire even reaches for it before being interrupted, foreshadowing the significance of that particular item. However, it's worth noting that the lighter is gold in the original game, not silver. There is something I find a bit odd, though. While placing a good amount of focus on Chris's lighter is understandable given its importance in the original game, the trailer also places a surprising amount of focus on a box of Delice du Marquis biscuits found in his room. While it could just be a humanizing trait showing Chris has a sweet tooth, the deliberate camera focus may suggest something more. Unlike the open foam food container, this box is neatly closed and appears unopened. Could the box contain hidden intel left for Claire? Or perhaps his mysterious partner? Or worse, could it be a surveillance bug planted by Umbrella agents tracking his moves? Or maybe it's something else entirely. Amidst all the mess, there is one comforting sight in the room: a potted green herb plant. In Resident Evil lore, these plants are famous for their remarkable healing properties. As a Resident Evil player, you'll always feel a sense of relief whenever you spot one of these somewhere in the game. Its presence in Chris's room tells us that while operating as a rogue lone agent, Chris kept the green herb close by as a survival method to keep himself patchworked and moving forward. Finally, we have to talk about the overall unorganized state of the apartment, which the concierge lady complains about. While some might think a messy room is just a character trait, I believe that it likely points back to his mental health. Remember, back in Resident Evil 2, players could examine Chris's star's desk, which was similarly cluttered and messy. However, what many people fail to realize is the fact that his desk was examined after the traumatic events of the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil 1. Chris wasn't in a good state of mind back then, and he clearly isn't now. I believe that the mess in his apartment now and his star's office desk back then isn't just carelessness. It's the physical manifestation of a man consumed by PTSD and an all-encompassing determination to stop Umbrella's evildoing. He simply doesn't have the capacity to worry about a tidy room amidst his mental turmoil. This isn't just laziness or disorganization. What we are looking at is a man who has pushed himself to the absolute physical and psychological brink. And once again, classic lore tells us that this is an established pattern. If we turn back to the pages of Jill's diary in Resident Evil 3, she writes about visiting Chris's apartment at midnight and found him buried deep in classified Umbrella research files. He told her, "The nightmare still continues. It's not over yet." But it's Jill's observation at the end that hits the hardest. She wrote, "Ever since that day, he has been fighting all by himself without rest, without even telling me." Let's unpack that last part. Jill Valentine is his trusted partner, a highly capable, military-trained STARS operative who survived the mansion right alongside him. And yet, Chris still kept her out of the loop. Why? Because he refused to put her in danger. And that brings us directly to Claire. If Chris wouldn't even share the burden with his battle-hardened partner, there is no way on earth he would tell his sister, who's just a 19-year-old college student at the time. Why didn't he just make a quick phone call or send a letter explaining his disappearance? Because having experienced it firsthand back in Raccoon City, Chris knows exactly what Umbrella is capable of. Umbrella is a global superpower capable of tracing and monitoring his line of communications. If Chris reached out to his sister, that single transmission would instantly implicate her. It would lead Umbrella's forces straight to her. So, he believes that not contacting her was the only way to guarantee her safety. He deliberately made himself Umbrella's sole target so no one else would get caught in the crossfire. He even warned Barry Burton not to tag along because he's worried Umbrella would come for Barry's wife and daughters. He planned to shoulder the entire burden alone. One of the reasons I love Resident Evil Code Veronica is because the game shows a different, more humane side of Chris. He isn't simply painted as a highly capable and determined military man. The game also showcases him as a fiercely protective big brother. Needless to say, I'm cautiously excited to see how he will be portrayed in the remake. All of these clues build an intriguing picture of Chris Redfield's hidden chapter in Paris. Looking at the apartment as a whole, it's clear that Capcom is using environmental storytelling to bridge the gap between the Chris we knew in Raccoon City and the hardened veteran he becomes later in the series. Even though he did not appear in the trailer in person, Chris leaves behind a web of mysteries that we'll have to untangle when the game finally drops. Let me know what you think. Why do you think the lady calls him odd? And what's your take on that suspicious box of biscuits? Is it really just some harmless snacks? Are there any other details I missed in this video? Feel free to write your own theories in the comments. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.